Super. Yeah, good morning to you, members of the media, and to Trinidad and Tobago. First, let me just say that the progressive movement of Trinidad and Tobago condemned outright the attempted coup by General Juan Jose Zuniga against the democratically elected government of Bolivia, led by the Movement for Socialism, President Arce. We condemn outright any military coup in Latin America and the Caribbean. This region is a zone of peace, and we have long gone past the era of military coups in Latin America. We are also standing firmly against any attempt to destabilize democratically elected governments and to destabilize any country in Latin America and certainly any country in the Caribbean. Which brings me to why we are here this morning outside the U.S. Embassy in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. The social movement, the progressive movement of Trinidad and Tobago stands and believes in international social justice. We also believe in the right to self-determination. And it is that belief in those fundamental values that brings us right here outside the U.S. Embassy to make a very important statement about a Caribbean country that is under the attack of U.S. imperialism. And I speak specifically of Cuba. I'm going to read for you a statement that was prepared by the social movements, the progressive movements in Trinidad and Tobago on the continued attacks by the U.S. against Cuba. We, the undersigned organizations, once again raise our collective voices to denounce the continued attack by the United States government against the people of our sister Caribbean nation, Cuba. Virtually every nation has that the commercial, financial, and economic blockade of Cuba by the United States must be ended. This is evidenced by the vote at the United General Assembly of the United Nations on the resolution tabled annually by Cuba calling for the ending of the blockade. For 31 consecutive years, the overwhelming majority of the world's nations have supported Cuba's demand to have the U.S. end the blockade. Last November, when the resolution once again came before the General Assembly, 187 out of the 193 member states of the United Nations voted for the blockade. Not surprisingly, the U.S. and Israel voted for it to be continued. The United States therefore stands totally isolated in the world on this issue. The commercial, financial, and economic blockade imposed unilaterally by the U.S. against Cuba is illegal, illegitimate, and a violation of the UN Charter. We must never forget the raison d'etre of the articulated in the official memorandum of the then Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State for Inter-American Affairs of the United States Department of the State, Lester Mallory, who wrote the following on April 6, 1960. I quote, "The majority of Cubans support Castro. The only foreseeable means of alienated internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government." End of quote. This is an unabashed admission that for the U.S., humanitarian concerns are of no importance. The lives, well-being, health of millions of Cuban people, including children, are of lesser value than that of Americans. All this in furtherance of the Monroe Doctrine, in which the U.S. claims that it can interfere in any country in this hemisphere once that suits U.S. interests. We totally repudiate that reprehensible position. Instead of the United States government moving out of the dark ages of the 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine and bringing its foreign policy in line with the world opinion, as evidenced by the UN General Assembly votes, it has in fact regressed. Thus, while the Obama administration executive order removed elements of the blockade that it could do that without the approval of the US Congress, the Trump administration reversed all those positive steps. What was worse is that Trump then imposed many new unilateral actions that made the blockade more draconian, thus causing more human distress. In particular, Trump added Cuba to the so-called list of countries that the US claims are state sponsors of terrorism. That list only the US creates without any international approval or agreement, without any involvement of the United Nations. The US added Cuba to without a shred of evidence. It was a naked political act in furtherance of the US position to create the conditions in Cuba for the overthrow of the government, as per Mallory's 1960 memorandum. This state sponsor of terrorism is a bogus categorization, but one that has far-reaching implications. Cuba is not involved in any sponsoring of terrorism. In fact, Cuba has been the victim of many terrorist attacks, the most dastardly of which was the October 1976 bombing of a Cuban airline that resulted in the deaths of all 73 people aboard. That terrorist act was organized by the United States CIA. The plane went down off the coast of Barbados. The bombs were put on board by 2 Venezuelans who boarded the plane right here in Trinidad, got off in Barbados, and then returned to Trinidad, where they were arrested and gave the information about their being recruited by the CIA operatives Posado Carriles and Orlando Bosch. Carriles and Bosch, harbored by the US and never paid for their crime of terrorism. The CIA organized the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion that failed. It initiated the placing of bombs at hotels and other public places in Cuba in the 1990s to disrupt Cuba's growing tourist industry, and so much more. So Cuba, the victim of terrorism, is now placed on a list of countries that are engaged in state-sponsored terrorism by the one state sponsor of terrorism, the United States. The other terrible irony is that the reason cited by the US for placing Cuba on this list is that Cuba has engaged with organizations that were involved in an armed struggle in Colombia. The truth is that Cuba, together with other states